welcome to those of you who are joining. Welcome. It's always great to see the numbers as they start coming in, as people are welcomed into the webinar space. For those of you who are joining, feel free to please use the chat function. Really like to encourage you to start thinking about some of the questions you would like to ask our wonderful guests this evening. We have a really fantastic hour of content, but it will be made so much more rich and interactive if we can get your thoughts and your experiences woven into the fabric. So please put your questions into the chat box, and also feel free to introduce yourselves to one another. I know we got a whole bunch of people calling in from various parts of the world. One of my favorite things to sort of loosen up and warm up for sessions as we wait for a few more people to come in is, if you feel so inclined, to let us know what your kind of go-to music is right now. I feel like we all probably have our playlists and our sort of Spotify songs that we've been listening to. So as a way to just sort of introduce yourselves to one another, feel free to just sort of throw up in that sort of chat box what kind of music you are listening to. All right, excellent. Okay, well, listen, we're going to get kicked off because we only have an hour together, and I know we have a lot of stuff to cover. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this second climate discussion that we're having as part of the Side Business School's Climate Alumni Group. And I should say tonight we're also very, very happy to have people from across actually the Oxford alumni community joining us. So thank you, and you are all very and most welcome. Tonight we're going to talk about the road to Cop26. For those of you who have your calendars in front of you, we will know that we are inching ever closer to the very important and critical COP26 meetings that will be hosted up in Glasgow in November of 2021. So we got 13 months to go. And this is going to be a really important session tonight because we're going to get a chance to understand a little bit about what are some of the key themes that we should all be tuning into in the planning for these really important meetings. So again, the framing for tonight is the road to COP26. We're really lucky tonight. We've got Nigel, who's the high-level champion for the COP26 process, and he's going to share a little bit about what he does in his role, and as well, what are those things that we should be tuning into. And then we're going to have a true dream team from Oxford share a bit about what they're working on, both in terms of their research and the programs and initiatives that they're leading that connect to the themes that are, again, important for us all to be tuning into for the next 13 months. So we're going to turn it over to them. We absolutely are going to have time for some questions for all of you. So please make sure you're entering your questions in quickly, fiercely, and courageously. There is no such thing as a bad question, and we all want to hear what's on your minds. With that, let me turn it over to Nigel, who's going to kick us off. Now, Nigel, you've come and done some guest lectures in some of the Side Business School classrooms, and I think you know that one of my first questions I love to ask any guest that comes into the classroom is the question we've asked all of you on the chat function tonight, which is, what is your go-to power up music? Like, if you've got to get like really like tuned up for what you're going to be doing, what do you listen to get you going?
Well, you know, I'm very excited that Kai has got Rage Against the Machine, Killing in the Name of, because, you know, that's one of my favorites, especially the kind of like 5-minute long, fuck you, I won't do what you tell me, escalating rant, which is just great. But I just put in Tom Joad and the Ghost of Tom Joad, and then any of you who've read The Grapes of Wrath and know the background to that lyric, it's about kind of committing to fighting injustice wherever you see it. So it's well worth a listen. Do you want me to start now, or you can?
Well, I was keen for you to jump right in, but actually, what I am also going to do, just because I feel like we've got a lot of music going, is actually I'm going to actually turn it over to each of our other panelists to introduce themselves with their song, and then we'll come back to you if that's okay, Nigel.
Yeah.
So Aoife, what do you think? Do you have some music that you're listening to kind of get things going and to get ready for the road to COP26?
Yeah, so I kind of alternate between needing to listen to high-paced electronic music at the moment. So I've been going back to Daft Punk a lot when I really need to get fired up. But then also, like, I kind of switched then to, I've been listening to Beethoven Pastoral Symphony a lot, because I need this kind of like from one extreme to the other. Like, you know, the Beethoven kind of it helps me to connect with nature and storms, and, you know, this like the calm after the storm, the build up to the storm. So I've been kind of, alternating between those two extremes.
I love it. There's like magic in the juxtaposition. I almost can almost hear the remix like there between Daft Punk and Beethoven. If someone hasn't done that yet already, then hopefully that's a little piece of innovation that will come from this evening. Abrar, it's so great to have you here. I do need to show you, Abrar. I'm wearing my t-shirt for you today, right? Accountants will save the world.
I need one of those.
So what kind of music are you listening to right now, Abrar?
So I think I'm probably leaning more towards Aoife's second choice. I've been actually listening to this Qawwali by Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. So people, for those who don't know what Qawwali is, it's this Islamic Sufi music. And, really, really deep, really peaceful. So I think that's what I need. But, Nusrat Fateh Ali sadly passed away 20 years ago. But, the music is still carrying on. His nephew took it forward, Rahat Fateh Ali Khan. And what's really amazing is that, last year, he was honored by Oxford. He was given a honorary doctorate in music for his services for music. So proud moment for Pakistan and amazing for Qawwali. So I would encourage you to listen to Qawwali, when you want to shift from Daft Punk.
Amazing. Well, I think what we should try and do is maybe we can try and put some of the links into the chat actually. And so people who may not be as immediately familiar with some of the music can have a chance to actually listen to it. So click on it and listen to it. Thanks, Abrar. And Kaya, what are you listening to these days?
Yeah, well, besides Rage Against the Machine, which you need plenty of these days, for something that's really joyful, Sylvan Esso is my favorite band. They've just put out a new album, and there's got this song called Rooftop Dancing, which is all about how, like, in Portland on the high rises, people are dancing on their rooftops, and during quarantine, people are just sort of like connecting from afar. So I really love that one. And then Janelle Monáe, Dirty Computers, could not be the more relevant album for what America is going through right now, and especially in the lead up to this election. Go watch the whole, what she calls, emotion picture. It's a beautiful kind of sci-fi dystopia, and it's very touching.
Excellent. Oh, I feel like I've got my evening now planned. This wonderful conversation then, and a whole lot of new music to bring into my world. So thank you all. Great. Well, Nigel, let's turn it back to you. Sort of as the high-level champion for the Cop26 process, you must be having that countdown clock pretty cleanly on your desk and knowing 13 months to go. So tell us a little bit about what are some of the key themes that are going to be a part of those meetings. And I guess a little bit about what this community of business leaders, of institution leaders, of organizational leaders can do to be with you on this journey.
Great. I'll try and riff on that for a bit. But just to Kaya's point about a sort of sci-fi view of the world, one of the things I'm working on is to try and have a program of speculative fiction authors in residence. Because one thing we've talked about this before is that apart from the side business school, which is now doing a good job of training people to think about the future and its rich uncertainty so that we can be better at shaping it, most of our leaders are not trained to think well about the future because it requires the use of the imagination, and imagination has been kind of banned as a source of knowledge from the academy, right? So I've long been a fan of what we call it speculative fiction because it sounds more serious than science fiction, right? Because some science fiction is just kind of shooting beats, is just sort of shoot 'em ups in the sky. But Kim Stanley Robinson, who's one of the masters of the genre, has just published a new book called The Ministry of the Future, and it's literally been published today. I got it last night, and the first chapter is a brutal description of a mass. I mean, an event of the like of which we can't even imagine now. You know that if we get above 35 degrees wet bulb, I think it is, so we have high humidity and high temperature, basically people die because sweating doesn't work, so people just overheat. So the first chapter describes an event where 20 million people in India die, and then the response from the Ministry of the Future, which is like this organization that was created in 2025 out of the failure of the UNFCCC to actually address the dynamics of climate change and all the implications. So I think it sounds like it's the job I want, is to be the Ministry of the Future, but it's also in the first 20 minutes reading a kind of a brutal reminder of just how, yeah, thank you, Charlie, for that. yeah, just how challenging the future might be that we've already created for ourselves, no matter what we do now. So I just wanted to start and give it a bit of context, just based on I've actually got out of my home in the last weeks and been on the first trip abroad. Even I think I've just sneaked into a little quarantine window. I was able to go to Italy, so I had to go and see some people in the Vatican because we're trying to mobilize faith communities, or trying to work with faith communities who are being mobilized by people who are better than that than me, like the Pope. But also was a sort of dialogue with the ministers and others from Italy and the UK who, you know, are the co-presidents of the COP. And then I've just been in Glasgow. So I just want to share three things that are just influencing the way I'm thinking at the moment. The Pope, who wrote this amazing encyclical called Laudato Si. You don't have to be religious. You know, he's been inspired by Saint Francis. So he's all about serving the poor and the planet. And if you ever want to read a document which is infused with purpose, the Laudato Si is pretty amazing. He's also done an incredible job in that document of calling out to all of humanity, not making it a Catholic thing, but like I think to, you know, people of goodwill, of faith and no faith all around the world. He's just published his latest encyclical. It's called Fratelli Tutti, which I think we'd have to translate it as brother and sisterhood of you know, that we're all in this together. Basically, it's a plea for solidarity. And then I've just been in these Pontignano dialogues. The UK Special Envoy for Food and Famine, Nick Dyer, was just sharing some of the fragility of the global food system, especially in the light of COVID, and how we could be facing some really serious famine events next year. That doesn't mean when people go hungry, but where lots of people die. And then I've just been in Scotland, which is going to be the host to Cop26, which is going to be a wonderful host, Glasgow. It's an earthy, working city with a rich history connected to the world through technology. The steam engine was invented near there. Through slavery, it's a major West Coast port. It's the sort of working class cousin to posh Edinburgh, which is where the money and the government is. They're looking at 100,000 extra people in a population of 2 million being unemployed in 6 months as a result of COVID. Right, it's kind of brutal. So these are all the context in the way I'm thinking about my job and Race to Zero. So, you know, the COP's going to be next November. I've got this job of working with you and everybody to try and make sure that we have more ambition and action on tackling climate change. And so we've launched this campaign called Race to Zero. Shah's, you've been great with the B Corps. We have well over 1,000 companies, 500 cities, loads of universities, $5 trillion of assets under management, and loads more people wanting to join in. We've got Thomas Hale from Oxford's been really helpful in giving some structure so that it's rigorous. That's going really well. It's changing the politics. Of course, the news from the EU and now from China is also changing the politics. And if Biden wins the election in America, and suddenly we'll have political tailwinds when we were looking at headwinds everywhere 6 months ago. So the COVID, funnily enough, might end up revealing the space to be more climate ambition politically. We're doing a lot of work now with a big partnership of well over 100 NGOs working with businesses, not NGOs and groups, but businesses, cities, etc., to then get more granular and define the pathways to zero such that everyone can see what they've got to do. And we're doing a whole series of dialogues, we're calling them in November, called the Race to Zero dialogues, to try and tell those stories. So anybody who's interested in any particular sector, you should be able to find something that is not just about how great people are, but actually collectively grappling with what are the actual trajectory we need to get onto in the next 5 years, so we've got enough momentum. But for some time now, and actually this recent trip and all those sort of human, the sort of heart and the human side of climate change is much more paramount in my thinking now. I've been thinking that we need a kind of a yang to the yin of the Race to Zero. Race to Zero is it's count the numbers down. It's kind of technology. It's get up the S curve. It's very kind of it's very technocratic. It's very markets. It doesn't really have a heart, right? But the resilience issue of all those people who are living on the edge, who could be tipped over by COVID or by an extreme weather event, who are living in informal settlements with no access to water or sanitation, who will be the most affected by floods and storm surges. Abra, in your region, all those people in Bangladesh where a third of the country was underwater, right, a month ago. So I feel like we need a campaign on resilience as well, which is much more global south, grassrootsy, rural communities, resilient food systems, informal urban communities. How do we address that? So I think, and I think that's going to be the big challenge next year, is that I think we'll actually have really good global progress on mitigation because of the politics and the technology and the economics. But COVID completely changes the context in terms of the north-south dynamic, which is at the heart of the geopolitics of climate change, and manifests in this commitment to 100 billion of north to south climate finance, public finance aid, basically. But we all know we need trillions, not 100 billion. And so what I'm increasingly thinking about, and I don't know the answer to this, is that we need something akin to the Marshall Plan, which post Second World War was the self-serving American plan to boost the economy in Europe, and a similar plan in Japan. Self-serving is important because it had to be, the case had to be made politically in America, right? Marshall had to make the case to Truman and to the American polity and country that it's worth spending a shed load of money on other people. That's always a difficult call for like elected politicians. So I don't think that case needs to be made, that unless there's a global recovery, then economically it'd be worse in developed markets because the bigger the pie, the better for everyone. And unless there's a global recovery, there's going to be a massive security issue and a kind of potential for breakdown of multilateralism. UK is the chair of G7 next year. Italy's the chair of G20. So the two countries who happen to be the co-hosts for the COP process also hold the chairs of those two really important multilateral processes, which, with a following wind from China, with a Modi keen to have a kind of legacy play, and with potentially a new president in the White House, maybe it's possible. But that, without that, I think we may find that we're doing a great job of mitigation, but resilience and the lack of resilience in the global south in particular becomes the political context with which we enter into the COP. So so what can everyone do to help? Join the race to zero, just get on with it, right? And get all your supply chain, all of your friends, all of your family. We're talking about Countdown. We have this Countdown event with TED on Saturday. Google it, join in, watch it for 5 hours as a binge, or just pick your favorite speakers. I think I'm speaking between, I think it's Priyanka, who's one of the most famous Bollywood actresses. Sorry, I hadn't heard of her, and the Pope. So I'm doing a little bit between those two. So I'm like a little bit starstruck, but we've worked really hard to make that really global. So we have very diverse voices from all aspects of society and all countries, young, old, and everything in between. And then we're launching a citizen mobilization campaign called Count Us In, which will start in the UK and India, but will go global with that 65 partners. So you can join all those things, but then I think the thing where we need to put our thinking hats on and our collaborative hats on more is how do we address this the north-south divide and avoid that being exacerbated with 100 million people falling back into extreme poverty and undoing 20 years of development in the global south.
Wow, Nigel.
Back to Chairman Love.
Yeah, I have to admit, when doing these things, I like to try and take notes, and in order to be able to sort of do a bit of a synthesis. And like my notes are all over the page because I feel like there were so many parts of
because my thinking is all over the page. Yeah, thanks.
But let's be honest, that this is the situation we're in right now, right? So we have to know that there are ways that we have to enter into the complexity in front of us, recognizing some of these divides, some of the importance for culture to take hold. And I just, I want to go back to where we started, which was around sort of science fiction. And I think your point about how do we open things up and create the space for more creative thinking. And I think with that comes that sense of empathy. It's about working across generations. It's the yin and the yang and the heart and the human side. So despite the fact that there seems to be a lot happening, actually, there are a couple of very clear golden threads that I think we weave together, right? Which is about how do we approach this as humans, as interdependent, people that we all share this miraculous planet that we call Earth. And I think this idea of heart and the human side of things is going to be a really important piece that we all need to lean into. And I think what you've also just shared, Nigel, is that there are a ton of ways that we can get into it. As you said, we can get on with it by setting our own race to zero commitments. We can tune into these events like the TED Countdown, like the November Dialogues, like the Count Us In. And I think just really having this awareness of this interdependence, I think is something we should all just be holding. So thank you for your remarks. Now I want to turn it over to Aoife, because as I sort of set up at the beginning of our conversation tonight, what we want to do is hear from Nigel, hear about these big themes. And then what we want to share was what sort of, as I said, the dream team of people at Oxford are working on. And that hopefully what we can share with you are some of those really exciting areas of research and some of the initiatives that are underway that again are a part of this journey in this road to Cop26. So Aoife is a really special member of the dream team. She is a joint appointment actually between both the Side Business School and the Smith School. And I think that's really important, right? So this is about recognizing the importance of climate science at the School of Geography and the role of business. And Aoife is a living bridge between those departments and schools. And she also, in that role, is the academic director of GoTo. And GoTo, I think, is one of those educational platforms that is really helping to engage and train students to be thinking about these big systemic issues. Now, Aoife, I know that that's an area of deep interest and that you have a deep level of expertise in. So I think we'd all just love to hear what's on your mind and what you're working on right now at Oxford as it relates to some of these things that Nigel has shared.
Sure, yeah, thank you, Sharon. Thanks, Nigel, for giving us such an expansive opening and thinking about the road to COP. So I'd like to connect to some of the things that Nigel mentioned, because I think they're very related to the teaching that we do and the research that we're trying to do across the Business School and the Smith School. And I see this having COP in the UK as an incredible opportunity to change the way that business engages with climate action, and that's what we've been trying to do at the Business School with the students this year. So GoTo was focused on climate action. Nigel very kindly was involved in helping us and is still involved in helping us translate some of the projects that the students have been working on into some action at the end of the academic year. So we've had this incredible year of engaging all of the MBAs, all of the executive MBAs in thinking about climate and how climate affects many different systems. And so that's kind of very related to the research that I'm doing. And one of the main things that I wanted to emphasize is the importance for our business students and our leaders to be able to think in systems. So that's one of the big things that we try to emphasize in the school. And it sounds very simple when you say it, like thinking in systems and identifying kind of these interdependencies and connections, as you mentioned, Shar, and how important that is. But just to kind of put into context, I mean, I think for the last 10, 15 years, I've been studying business responses to climate. And I think many businesses have been viewing their responsibilities in terms of responding to climate very much focused on their own organizations, right? Just thinking about, okay, I need to think about and report on what I'm doing, what I'm emitting. And it's been very much kind of a focus on the boundaries of my own company. And we're seeing a really big change now because we're not seeing the progress that we need to see. We're across many different industries. It's very apparent that we're very much behind where we need to be. And what we're trying to do at the school is to really emphasize the fact that this focus on an individual, your own individual company, regardless of what industry you're in, it's not going to lead to the type of change that we need to see happening. And this kind of thinking in systems, connecting with competitors in your industry, learning how to do that, being open to doing that. Those are the types of skills that we're trying to develop in our students, and to help them go out and be the leaders that we need them to be, to shape the future that Nigel talked about. So that means engaging with not just other companies, it means engaging with policymakers, right? So, you know, the beauty of Cop26 and the road to Cop26 is that this is an opportunity for business to engage with policymakers, with NGOs, with the public, but learning how to do that is very difficult, and it requires training and research to be able to enable those things to happen in a way that we can actually lead and support change. So I think, you know, the first kind of main point for me is that our work is very much focused on that, moving away from thinking linearly, thinking about my own organization, and moving much more towards kind of thinking in systems. And then I just wanted to pick up on the point that Nigel, you made about I think it comes down to language. So this kind of race to zero and net zero, I think it's really important that we actually connect climate to something positive too, and a positive vision of the future. I think that's, to me, where the role of business is absolutely critical. And I think especially when we combine the COVID crisis and climate. And I think we have this opportunity now in many industries, because we need to recover from COVID. In some ways, I think this is the opportunity that might connect the global north and the global south. So we're facing such extreme needs to think about jobs and job losses in the global north, that it changes the conversations that we're having. Think about the types of change that need to happen across different systems. And that opens up opportunities to deal with climate, right? Because a lot of the industries that we need to see investment in, renewables, infrastructure, they create jobs. It's not just about you know, responding to climate, it's also about enabling people to be in jobs that have a future, a clean future. And that's the same across the global north and the global south. And I think this kind of combination of COVID and climate opens up this new space for us to engage in ways that connect with people, like you said, Nigel. I mean, I think this is absolutely something that gets lost, and especially in the global south, where we see the impacts of climate on a regular basis affecting people's lives. And it's not, you know, there's no discussion necessarily of net zero in some of the communities that are affected by extreme weather events. You know, that doesn't mean anything to them. It means something. You know, net zero, and the language around kind of net zero means very many different things in different places. And I think we need to be very careful to be able to translate that for different contexts, and to be able to kind of think about what people in different contexts really need. And I think, just to kind of bring that to a close with the role of business, business is well positioned to do that, right? You know, we need businesses across industries to engage in rethinking business models, and to do that, businesses are well positioned because they are skilled at looking at people's needs, and responding to those needs, and creating not just new technological solutions, but connecting those to people's daily lives, and to the things to the services that they need and that they use, that they look for. But that requires, it just requires leadership, it requires ambition, and it requires courage to actually kind of take those steps to do the rethinking and the focus on a better future.
Excellent, Aoife. I mean, again, I feel like we're covering so much wonderful territory here. And I think just understanding sort of the importance of thinking about systems dynamics. And I think where you went with the role of business and really rethinking business models, and how we take these things into account is something that I'm sure many of the people that are listening to us on the line are probably thinking about within their own businesses right now. So I think what I would just sort of say, if these things are of interest to you, I think definitely tune in to the work that Aoife is leading, and again, her very special joint appointment role. And I also think there's something in these go-to projects that are pretty interesting for people to sort of, again, read and understand in terms of how some of the future leaders are being trained to approach this from a systems dynamic. So thank you very much, Aoife. Abrar, I'd love to move on to your area of research and focus, because you work globally, and I know climate finance has been a really important thematic area of focus for you. And as I said, I'm wearing my Accountants Will Save the World t-shirt, because whenever I see you, Abrar, I have to wear it as one of my favorite rock star accountants in the world. So would you be able to share with us a little bit about what you're working on right now, and again, how it relates to these dynamics around the role of business and systems change?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Shah, and thank you, Nigel, for kind of setting the tone. And, you know, as you were speaking, I was going to speak about something slightly different, but, you know, as you were speaking, I thought, you know, okay, these are like some of the areas that I want to focus on. So I do want to focus on the kind of the north-south divide that you're talking about. Because I think that's a really, really important aspect that, you know, is instrumental in the COP negotiations. I think that's been a stumbling block as well, you know, how do we get different countries, you know, the developed countries, developing countries, the emerging countries to come together and have a kind of a common language. A lot of times when we talk about net zero, you know, as Aoife was saying, you know, that's a language that's, you know, it's common here. It's, you know, it's people understand that. But when we go to the developing country prospect, or, you know, when we have those discussions, you know, some of the challenges are completely different. You know, as you said, resilience, adaptation is at the forefront. Of course, you know, everyone wants to reduce and mitigate the impacts of climate change. And that's happening. It's not that that's not happening. You know, you can see, you know, the amount of clean energy that's going on, the projects that are coming in, transportation, all those aspects are happening, but that's not always the priority. I think the conversation always starts with, okay, how do we live with the impacts of climate change? You know, our populations right now are feeling those impacts. You know, go to Pakistan, you know, we've had like, you know, these horrible monsoons, right? The entire city was underwater, and there were like crazy pictures coming out of people like actually had to swim their way to work. And so that's the reality. And so some of these conversations, when they happen, you know, we have to think about, you know, what the world is experiencing right now. And yes, net zero is important, but so you know, and I'm sure others are you know, can talk more about net zero. I will talk about, you know, how my work is kind of influencing and how I'm thinking about some of those challenges. So I've been pretty much focused on climate finance. And the reason I picked up climate finance was because every time, you know, we talk about climate change, finance comes in. And it's not that we don't have enough finance, it's just that that's the starting question. And so my research really focuses on the Green Climate Fund. And I think it's a wonderful mechanism in the sense that, you know, it's the largest global climate public fund. It serves the COP. It's, you know, it's part of the UNFCCC mandate. And, you know, in 2015, when we saw, you know, those pictures of, you know, the world coming together, you know, Christina Figueroa, you know, holding everyone's, you know, hand and celebrating, the big tangible outcome out of those negotiations was, you know, really setting up the Green Climate Fund, making it operational. But really to understand that, you know, we have to go back a little bit as well to understand where these debates on climate finance have been coming from, you know, why there are challenges and why, you know, developing countries, developed countries have been at odds. You know, one of the key principles in climate finance is this CBDR, which is this common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. And what that simply means is that while, you know, the entire world is being impacted by climate change, we feel those impacts, you know, the responsibilities are different. You know, developed countries historically have developed, you know, have better capacity to adapt to some of those challenges. And hence, you know, they need to support developing countries. And climate finance became one of those challenges that, you know, under this principle, you know, developed countries have to fund developing countries. And that became the origin of climate finance and climate, you know, of the Green Climate Fund itself. So the original ambition, and no one knows where that actual figure came from, but, you know, everyone spoke about this $100 billion a year number. And it's still a mystery, and I don't know where, you know, who came up with that number. But, you know, back 10 years ago, that was the number that was thrown around. You know, we need $100 billion. And I think last week, David Attenborough came and said, no, we need $500 billion a year. So that was the start for climate finance. You know, how do we get $100 billion, and, you know, how do we get funding in the Green Climate Fund? You know, sadly, we weren't able to get that funding. The Green Climate Fund in 2015 did start with about $10 billion of commitment, for 5 years. And then, unfortunately, the US pulled out. So the figure went down to $7 billion. And that was the figure that, the world was playing with to help developing countries adapt and mitigate to the impacts of climate change. And now, that figure has been deployed. And the next replenishment that has come in is again just $10 billion. So that's, it's not a huge number when we talk about $100 billion, we talk about $500 billion. So the first question is, how do we raise that ambition? And I think that's where the private sector can come in. I think that's where there's a huge amount of opportunity. So when you look at the Green Climate Fund, what it's really doing is it's playing with $10 billion, but it wants to raise that money to $100 billion or maybe even more. So the whole idea is, how can they leverage that funding and make it $100 billion? And for every dollar that the Green Climate Fund invests, it's looking for like $7 to come from the private sector. And so the whole idea is, how do we create those collaborations? How do we get private sector interested in funding projects from the Green Climate Fund? How do we get other organizations to come in? And some of the key challenges, and I think this is what we really have to overcome, is when we start, like I spend a lot of time looking through all the projects the Green Climate Fund has initiated. I looked at all the different organizations that work with Green Climate Fund, and just to kind of clarify, Green Climate Fund itself doesn't implement any projects. It's a funding organization, and what it really does is it works through partner organizations. Its objective is to take this country approach, to empower countries to actually create projects and then bring those projects to the Green Climate Fund. And what that really means is that there's an opportunity for local organizations to develop their capabilities as well. But at the same time, there are other players, the World Bank, the UNDP, all the conventional players are still part of that process as well. So where the private sector can actually come in is, identifying those projects. What's really happening right now is, if you look at the entire flow of funding, what Green Climate Fund has dispersed, most of it is going to conventional projects, right? They're going to mitigation projects, which is good. That's where I guess this race to zero is helpful. But they're going in developing countries, which, yes, values them, but really is not making that direct impact. So if I look at the funding, 60, 70% is going to mitigation. Really, a very small amount is actually going to adaptation. And the reason is that it's really difficult to make a business case out of adaptation. And I'm not saying that for every adaptation, for every resilience, we need to have a business case. But what's really important is that how can we get private sector to think about funding projects in the adaptation space? Like that could be, food security, it could be flood resilience, it could be, empowering local communities to adapt to some of those challenges. And I think that isn't really happening. So a lot of this money just goes to conventional projects. And those are easy tick boxes that you can have. And so when I look at the Green Climate Fund and I take a step back and look at its real objectives of, having a paradigm shift or being the main mechanism through which we can actually tackle the impacts of climate change, it really wouldn't be able to do that without the help of private sector. It wouldn't be able to do this without really developing, generating projects, with demonstratable business models, with demonstratable impact. And I think that's where the space is. So I will pause here. There's many other things I wanted to speak about, but Nigel kind of pushed me in this direction. So thank you for that.
I love it. I think Nigel set a beautiful stage for us all to be able to riff on things that are actually quite meaningful and quite deep to the work that we do. Because I think there are a series of really interesting golden threads emerging here, right? This is about systems change. It's the importance of thinking and acting with this wider, like widened aperture. And it's really about recognizing that how we address this is through collaboration. So Abrar, what I took away from your remarks was like to always remember that this is happening now. And I think, the story that you shared is a really powerful one that we should hold those stories tight, because it's not something that is in the future. It is happening right now. That we need to step up and we need to think about the levels of ambition that we currently have and where we need to be. And that we need to work together. And I think this point on, in particular, the adaptation space is a really interesting point. And actually what I would encourage actually all panelists to do is, if you have particular areas of research or focus, please pop them into the chat. I know there's a lot of people posting different links. So Abrar and Aoife, I would just really encourage you to throw some of your research into that chat box so that people can tune into a little bit more and literally do a bit of a double click on some of the things that I know you're only just briefly touching on in the time that we have today. Okay, well, last but not least, and certainly not least, because she is a total rock star, and so happy, Kaya, that you were able to join us tonight. Kaya is the Net Zero Policy Engagement Fellow at the Smith School, which is at the School of Geography. She's also mobilizing and leading an incredible movement to get young people to set the agenda. So Kaya, I want to sort of invite the floor to you to speak about your work around net zero, obviously as it connects to Oxford, but I would also really welcome you to share your view of what you've been learning and feeling and picking up through the planning for the Youth Setting the Agenda work at the November Dialogues.
Thanks so much, Shar, and thanks so much to all the other panelists. It feels like we have a real theme tonight with adaptation, and I have to start this conversation with a story that I heard today. So I'm working, as Shar said, in the race to zero to get people, businesses in particular, to set more ambitious net zero targets. So one of the things that we're doing is we're bringing young climate leaders, mostly from the global south, to tell their stories to business leaders who usually, these business leaders at the executive level of companies, have never met a climate activist except for perhaps screaming at them from like across a Greenpeace boat or on the streets of London. And so what we're doing with these dialogues is we're bringing climate leaders, climate activists into a space where they can have a real conversation like we're having right now. And one of the stories that I heard today from one of our young climate leaders who works in communities in Africa, just really, I can't shake it, and I won't be able to. She was working in Kenya, and she went into this woman's home, and this woman had just finished boiling rocks because she wanted her kids to fall asleep before they realized that there was no food left because of the drought from climate change in Kenya. And that story just brings home why the race to zero is, it's not a race that is about carbon emissions. It's not about atmospheric gases. I mean, it is, because that's what connects us all. But it's about people. And when people ask me, is it too late? That's always the question you get with climate change work. Is it too late? I've heard it's just too late. Well, too late for who? Too late to save one more child from having to starve? It's not too late. And that's why we have to work at the system level. That's why the work that Abrar does, raising funds, I mean, the difference between 5 billion and 100, and that's, we see it working when we ask these questions of people in power. I think about this with regards to the US election. I mean, 4 years ago, climate change was barely on the agenda, and now the Democratic candidates were arguing over whether 15 trillion was a good enough climate plan or 5 trillion. And that's where we want to be setting the conversation. And so the race to zero, what's appalling to me right now is that companies don't have net zero plans. That's appalling to me, given this conversation. A few stats on that. So interestingly, oil and gas companies, despite being probably the worst, offenders, supposedly, because they get quite a lot of scrutiny from investors, they are more likely than other industries to set oil and gas companies are more likely to set net zero targets. And yet, even though we did a survey of them at the Smith School, we did a survey and we asked them first, do you agree that the climate crisis is serious? Most of them, yes. Fair enough. They're not denying that anymore. Are you committed to it? Fewer of them were committed to it. They didn't careful to commit to anything. When you got down to actually setting a net zero target in line with the Paris Agreement, only 10% of the oil and gas companies that we interviewed and that we reviewed had, and so I'll link that. But that's starting to change, because even since last year's COP, we've seen a huge increase in corporate commitments. And I really have to give a shout out to, I have to embarrass Shar and give a shout out to the B Corp community here. I think the B Corp community, there's about 1,000 companies in the Race to Zero right now that have set, and Race to Zero means you have a meaningful net zero commitment, not just any kind of carbon neutral commitment with just scope 1 and maybe all offsetting, but you have to have a meaningful commitment. There's some minimum criteria that Oxford helped to develop. And the B Corp network is responsible for, I think, about 85% of the companies in the Race to Zero right now. And that just shows, though, that that's a community where they ask. Employees in the B Corp network feel that they're stakeholders, so they ask. And when you ask questions of companies, that's when we get these commitments. So what I want to do is, because I don't think I would have known a year ago where to start in asking my organization how to set a net zero target. I was feeling in the dark. I was asking Oxford that they should set a net zero target. And I was like, well, what does that mean? And our sustainability professionals were trying to figure that out. So we realized that there was kind of a dearth of like open and accessible information on that. And we want to empower every single person, every single one of you, to ask your organization, whether it's a school where your kids go, whether it's where you work, whether it's a company that you used to work for. I mean, how many organizations do we interface with every day? When we get our coffee, we interface with an organization. You can ask them if they have a net zero target. So that is a resource that can help you that Oxford has been developing. Within that resource, we're also developing like a tool library for organizations that should be live soon. You can see sort of a sample of it in there. And I won't share my screen. I'll let people do their independent learning, clicking around, get distracted doing the real stuff while I'm blabbering on. But the point is that Nigel made a really, I think, great framing. We need to move on from net zero because the adaptation work is already happening. People are already hungry, and we can't undo 20 years of development work. My stepdad works in development, and when he realized, it took him a while, we used to argue all the time because he didn't quite realize that some of what he was doing in development work was actually worsening the climate crisis. And when I finally sat down with him and he realized the seriousness and how much of his life's work was going to be undone, this 60-year-old man cried in front of me. And I just, and we didn't always have the best relationship, but we got closer through those tough conversations. And I want everyone to go back to their families and have those tough conversations. Ask them, does your company set a net zero target? And what can we do to support the adaptation effort? And I've completely lost myself in sort of this this great call to action, but Shar, I'm gonna pass it back to you. Did you want me to talk about anything else that Oxford? Oh, Oxford has a huge research program now on solutions for achieving net zero. We have an equity and equality net zero fellow coming in. We have a net zero fellow who's working on greenhouse gas removal. We have a net zero fellow working on nature-based solutions. So just keep watching this space. The site that I sent you is going to be updated with research all the time. And then we also are doing these really like kind of emotive, informative events with these business leaders. So we'll be putting out info about that. They're called Youth Setting the Agenda in the November Dialogues. And we hope you'll attend and spread the word about those events, because the young people who are coming to speak, they're bringing me to tears on a daily basis now. So look forward to seeing you all then.
Kaya, thank you for your remarks. I mean, I think you've given us all a lot to think about. And I think starting with your day and the experience you've had, I think is just one of those moments that we should all just reflect on and hold, because as you said, this is happening and these are human stories, and that should be the kind of energy and fuel that pushes us all to go further and faster together. I would sort of like just to give a shout out to say that if anyone who's on the line today is interested in engaging in the work that Kaya is involved in, I know she's going to put some links in. We also will probably be sending out an email to all of you who are on the line tonight when we have the invitation and the registration materials ready for these Youth Setting the Agenda events. So definitely keep an eye out on them if you are interested in being across sort of a series of these quite powerful intergenerational conversations. We have about 10 minutes left. And I know there's a couple of questions that are sort of in the chat here. And I know a couple of them actually have been asked and have been cleared. But I actually just want to ask, because I think what you've shared, Kaya, is actually really quite deep and incredibly powerful. I wondered if I could just ask each of our panelists to just briefly reflect on anything that came to you from what you've heard from Kaya. I don't know if Aoife, maybe do you want to go first? Is there anything that sort of jumped out to you about that connects to the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so I think, I think especially it's about people. I think that's kind of the one of the big takeaways from all of our remarks, and definitely from Kaya, from your very kind of emotional experience of really feeling that it's really we need to think about people. It's not, and I think that helps to open up those conversations with maybe people in your business that haven't had climate on their radar before now. If you can kind of think about how that connects to people's lives, then it just makes the conversation much more tangible. And I think we're kind of getting to the point now where those conversations are becoming tangible because of the people connection. The other thing I would say is that I think it's really important, the work that Kaya and Shara, you've been doing on collecting resources and kind of focusing on, we're developing a couple of executive education programs at the moment to try to help with training people in organizations to figure out what does net zero mean, because, you know, we're experiencing that ourselves, as Kaya said, in the university, in the business school. We're trying to figure out how can we be ambitious as an organization? What does that mean for us? It means something very different for companies in different industries. There isn't a lot of training specific to different industries to kind of make sense of a very general goal of net zero for individual companies. And we're planning to do a lot more research on that, studying different companies as they go through processes of developing expertise in being able to do that. And you know, this is something that's going to have to be sustained over a long period of time as well. It's not about just setting a target. There's a lot of detailed processes that need to be put in place to make sure that continues for the foreseeable future. So that kind of shapes a lot of the work that we're planning to do in the next few years, connected to the initiatives that Kaya has mentioned.
Great, thank you, Aoife. And Nigel, what I'm going to probably do is come to you last, because I'd love for your sort of your maybe summary comments before we send out for the night. But Abrar, are there any thoughts that come to mind from your work and how it connects to sort of some of the things that Kaya has shared?
Yeah. So again, I'm a big kind of believer in action on ground. I know there's a lot of policy that goes on that's really important to set the tone. But the real work happens when you get policy on ground, because that's where the impacts of climate change are being felt. They're not being felt at the policy level, but it's where that intersection happens. So I think that's where a lot of work needs to happen. I think two points I want to make there. One is, a lot of work that I've done at the community level, at the local level, has also been kind of trying to change this narrative a little bit. Because a lot of times when we talk about challenges, we talk about gaps, we talk about deficits, we talk about, this is what the typical, what Kaya was saying, the typical development model is, what's missing here, and how do we get that piece on ground? Because, okay, there's not enough education, there's not enough resources. And so we're always trying to fill gaps. I think the other way to look around is that, humans have always been adapting, right? You go on ground, you'll find mechanisms, you'll see that, houses are built on stilts because they experience flooding, or people will move to other areas. So one kind of focus that I picked up was the strength-based approach. How do we utilize strengths? Or how do we find examples of people already adapting, and how do we incorporate those strengths into policy? And I know there's a lot of participatory work that goes on, but when you really look at policy, truly, it's missing. I've seen people make policy documents. They'll sit in a room and they'll make policy documents. But I think it's really finding those examples, finding those strengths and not those deficits. So I think one aspect is, let's look at, what's really happening on ground already to inform policy. I think the second aspect is, where I'm really passionate about is this kind of participatory approach, right? Because this challenge is so broad, one actor can't do it. Like one policymaker, one country will not be able to do it. So how do we create those communities? And I know this is what, some of the work that you've been doing on bringing all these different actors together, but it's also about not just bringing them together, but how do you actually mobilize action? How do you create those structures, those opportunities where, the networks come together to solve a challenge, not just to meet and discuss. And I think that's where I feel, where the school can really play a positive role of being that space where, you bring people together to solve some of these challenges. So those would be my two kind of points here.
Thank you, Abrar. And we are only a couple of minutes out before sending everyone on to their evening way to process and to reflect on the things that are shared. So I am going to turn it over to Nigel for a few closing remarks. What I do want to say is I do see you, Abhay and Aldo and Alicia and Ruth, and the questions that you've asked in this chat. We're not going to be able to get to them in this discussion right now, but what I'd like to do is sort of take some of these questions, and what I might do is see if we can find you some of those answers. So I think we've got your emails. So I didn't want you to think we have not seen the questions you've asked, but we will find a way to continue the conversation with you all and anyone else who still has some outstanding questions. Nigel, I would love if you wouldn't mind just a few minutes to reflect, I think, on what you've heard tonight as you think about the road to Cop26 and some of these themes and how they might be coming together for you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for the really rich conversation, everybody. And I wish we were in a pub so we could carry on over a pint or two. Just a few thoughts. I mean, more and more, I think this is back to what we were talking about why business leaders should read more science fiction. That we're trying to navigate an uncertain future. But towards some ends which we have are more or less clear. Like we want, let's say we want to end climate change or to achieve the SDG. So it's this sort of interesting juxtaposition of a desire for agency in an interconnected and uncertain world. So just a few thoughts. I think that all the work on net zero is really important. We shouldn't forget that we know the end point, right? We know zero is the end point. That's kind of helpful. And also we got a pretty good idea of how to get there, but so there's never crippling uncertainty. There's always enough certainty to act now, and often we make the road by traveling. So that's the balance, right? I think it's a particular balance of people working in academia, right? Because there's this sort of idea that the academy should deliver certainty. And so when you're talking about pathways, you have to have certainty about what you're going to do tomorrow if you're a business leader, but you can't have certainty about what you're going to do in 5 years or 10 years time. Similarly with policies, right? How do we have policies that are intelligently designed to be directionally right without pretending to know what's going to happen in 10 years? So I think it's really, really encouraging to see a lot more hard work being done about pathways and about that definitions of net zero, but let's just make sure we don't ever give anyone the impression that we don't know enough to be acting fast now. I remember Hannah Jones, my favorite leaders in the business community, ran innovation and sustainability at Nike. When they committed to net zero, she said, we know exactly the first third what we're going to do. Second third, we've got a portfolio of innovations. We're confident the improvements will come from there. And the last third, we haven't got a clue, but it's maybe 10 years or 15 years away. I think Abrar, when you talk about finance, it seems to me that if there's one area that needs more of a systems approach, it's finance. Even the 100 billion, it's a kind of a meaningless figure plucked out of nowhere to talk about one slice of capital. It's not based on what are the problems we need to solve and what are the economics of those problems. So as you say, the economics of investing in renewables are very different from the investing in adaptation measures. And my favorite example of renewables, it costs more to build a solar farm in Spain than it does in Germany. Just think about that for a minute. There's a lot more sun in Spain than in Germany. I've lived in both countries, right? The reason is it's all about the cost of capital, and Spain's got high policy risk because they did a big policy U-turn retrospectively a few years ago, and the markets still don't trust them. So there's just all these kind of systems and things. And I do think this sort of, when we talk about participatory, I feel like there's different levels of participatory. Like there's Slum Dwellers International, Sheila Patel working to have slum dwellers work with data experts, work with city authorities to try and establish property rights so they can borrow money so they can improve their houses or build houses. But there's also the participatory process at the sort of in the Caribbean. How does CARICOM and the Caribbean governments somehow come together to reduce the risk so that they can borrow enough money to Last point about, I think it was Alicia who asked the question about is it too late? It's a good point. People ask me that question. My general response when people ask me that question is to get angry. It's like, what do you fucking mean, is it too late? Are we going to just stop acting now and just let it get worse and worse and worse? Yeah, it's too late. It's already gone too far. There's bad things going to happen. But to say it's too late really suggests that, I mean, what does it suggest? It's kind of it's a rude question. So I slap them. Get angry. It's a bad question. Really think about what are people saying? Are we going to stop acting for future generations? Yeah, I'm getting angry even thinking about it now. Imagine if someone actually asked me in a pub. Maybe it's good I'm not in a pub. I think Kaya's point about this story about an individual human being and that story about boiling the rocks, right? I think there's a real danger we can spend too much time reading what I call gloom porn, like 6 degrees, uninhabitable planet. I mean, there's a whole industry there about writing books about how fucked we are. It's not helpful to read too much of that stuff, right? Because you get depressed and overwhelmed. I think what is really important is to find a way of connecting humanly. Like if you know somebody, who works in a country that, and by the way, it's in our own country, like people are suffering from floods, but I think humanized climate change is an important thing for academics and comfortable global north climate activists like me. I mean, I did a lot of work over the years with Leaders Quest who've helped bring this countdown event together, going to visit leaders, in the informal settlements in the morning and in the central banks in the afternoon, because I think being grounded in the humanity and the human crisis that is climate change is something that especially when we're living comfortable lives, we have to be creative. And that's one of the things that the go-to work, I think, taking a systems approach, going to visit, meeting the world as it is, does beautifully. And that business leaders need to learn to meet the world as it really is, not as it appears just in the boardroom.
Absolutely. I mean, what a powerful way to end this hour together. And I know we're probably going to be saying goodbye to some people who have had to leave at the top of the hour. For those that you are still here and still tuning in, I hope you've had as enriching an hour as I feel like I have. I feel like we've traveled a fairly long distance together, and we've heard a range of really important perspectives. So my one request is that you all take a little bit of what you heard tonight, do something about it, and talk to somebody about what you've learned and what you're feeling about this road to Cop26 and these themes that you've heard from Nigel, Aoife, Abrar, and Kaya. So thank you all. I know we have still some questions that were still outstanding, but I do actually think in this final round, we've picked up on some of the really interesting reflections that you've had. But as always, please keep on sending your feedback. For those of you who are still there, and Nigel, this is just sort of a sort of shout out to you. When we were in a meeting together in February before the world, did its backflip and we all sort of had to reset. I remember this post-it note because it was something you said. You said we needed to be guided by the science and inspired and moved by poetry. And I have this on my bulletin board, which is right in front of me here. And so for those of you that are still on the line, I'd like to end tonight with sharing a little bit of a piece of poetry as a way to sort of send us all out. And it's called The Hopi Elders Speak. You've been telling the people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go back and tell them that this is the hour. And there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Are you in the right relationships? Where is your water? Know your garden. It is time to speak your truth. Create your own community. Be good to each other and do not look outside yourself for the leader. This could be a time. There is a river running very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be very afraid. They will hold on to the shore. They will feel they are being torn apart and they will suffer greatly. Know that the river has a destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle, keep our eyes open and our heads above the water, see who is in there with you and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment we do, our growth and journey comes to a halt. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourself, banish the word struggle from your attitude and vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred time and in celebration. We are the ones we've been waiting for. So with that, I would like to say thank you to our wonderful panelists, say thank you to all of you that are still here on the line, and please stay tuned. We'd love to continue this conversation with you. Have a wonderful evening.